Today, we ended the tournament. 2 games, 11 cancelled spin-offs, 5 whole years all leading to this moment. The ultimate Find the Doge2 timeline is finally complete. The pieces are in place for us. Now all we have to do is put together the story of Doge's intergalactic wars and revenge back together. Hello Internet, welcome to Gay Theory, the show that feels like a kid revealing the class project he has been working on for a year, except here it's the class project I've been working on for the past 5 years of my life. This one is big, my friends, and I'm gotta admit, I'm kinda nervous. I've never attempted a complete timeline on this game since 2020. Back when we didn't know who Killanova was, the origins of Cousin's Doge were still unknown, and "we have to get the coyote wet" was a phrase I didn't think I would have to utter. But since the last time I did this, we had many more Doges, the death and revival of Find the Doge's tree, and more Doge ships than in the entirety of the sea. It is exhausting trying to keep track of this whole game, which is honestly why I'm here today. The lore at this point is complicated, it is full of speculation and theory, so to hopefully make it a little easier for everyone, and to give us all a baseline to talk about this game moving forwards into the future, my current working Find the Doge2 timeline. But just before I do begin, I want to explain a couple of things. First of all, this timeline is massive. Seriously, it is huge. This project towers over any other video I ever made on this channel, but when you look at the totality of Find the Doge2, it really boils down to just one character of one Doge, and that is the Doge. His successes, his failures, his rise in becoming the first Lord of Time and Space, and his eventual fall caused by the monsters he created, only to survive and witness the massacre that he has caused. That's why I decided to split this timeline into 3 main chunks: the birth of the Doge, the first Doge War, and the second Doge War, which is basically the fight between Killanova and Supernova and all the other stuff that happened during the events of Find the Doge2. Because there are a lot of big revelations in this thing, and that seemingly came out of nowhere, and things I want to talk about further, I decided to dedicate one episode to each chunk. I originally wanted it to be just one video, but it felt sort of incomplete without a sort of explanation at the end of each one. Once this whole thing is done, I promise I'm gonna put this all into one massive video, so you can just skip my explanations for now. But for now, this felt like the best, most satisfying, most complete way to do this. That being said, this is still about the story, the broad strokes of the game, so to make sure you guys don't think I'm just pulling answers out of thin air, not only am I talking about some of the more controversial bits at the end of each chunk, in the description I will put any additional information that you need throughout the video. So if you wish to understand something in more detail, you know exactly where to look. So sit down, grab some popcorn or your pitchforks if you're the type to get upset when I say something controversial, and make sure that you subscribe, since this is a video you're going to want to come back to a few times in order to fully dissect. Now without further ado, let me tell you the story of a powerful Doge who slowly descended into madness, and along the way discovered what it truly means to be the Lord of Time and Space. Our story begins not in the 1980s, the 1960s, or the 1930s, but all the way back at the start of time itself. Back then, there was only one Doge, and that Doge was very lonely. For years, this Doge didn't know what the purpose of his life was, stuck in the great unknown. He traveled through the great unknown hoping to find the purpose, but ultimately he found nothing. But one time, he found another Doge, just like him, Cousin's Doge. Cousins, just like him, wandered through the great unknown, wondering what its purpose is. Cousin's Doge wasn't actually just one Doge. They were a combination of the space, the blue, and the Nachte. Finally, our friend, who was the one and only Doge, found some entertainment. He knew he wasn't the only one here. Cousin's Doge would dance and sing, and the Doge would watch, because where else could he go? But even if the Doge felt a little bit less lonely, he still couldn't help but wonder, are there others just like me stuck there in the vast darkness? So there for years they explored the darkness together, but never did they find anything. The Doge wanted to be just like cousins, to sing and dance, and make your worries go away. But no matter what he tried, the Doge always felt empty inside. He could sing and he could dance, but it was nothing in comparison to Cousins, who was always lively and full of spirit. And over time he realized the solution. He didn't need to overcome what he was scared of. He could just put it back. And so he made an alter ego, one that we call Doge. And so whenever the Doge wanted a bit of peace, he just pretended to not be himself, and left the Doge behind in the back of his mind, forgetting about all the bad parts in his life. His alter ego wasn't perfect. Occasionally it didn't work, and he would return to his former self, but it was good enough for him. Doge and Cousins would sing and dance together. Finally he was able to enjoy life, just like the only Doge he knew could. He could make Cousins laugh, just as Cousins made him laugh. And things could have ended there. It could have been the end of the story. It could have been perfect, had it not been for one thing. The three parts of Cousins no longer wanted to be one, and turned blue. One third of Cousins, who was tired of having to spend his time singing and dancing with the other two. He wanted to be his own, and not listen to what the other parts told them to do. And now when the Doge finally found a way to beat his fears, now Cousins was the one suffering. He wanted to help Cousins, but he didn't know how to. And then one of the three had an idea. His name was Nachte, and while the others were singing and dancing, he was thinking how all of this worked. And finally he announced that he might have a way the tree could be split, and Cousins could become one on his own. And so now there were 5 Doges in the world. For Space, Nachte, and Blue were finally on their own, just like they wanted to for so long. But the 3 parts, which we call the Trinity, were not happy. Why did Cousins make them have to stay like this for so long? And why did they seem so unhappy that they were finally on their own? Not only that, instead of developing his own personality, Cousins proceeded to act like he was still them, but he wasn't. He was not like his own Doge. So why could he not act like it? And over time, the Trinity began to grow angry. How dare Cousins be unhappy that they wanted to have their own freedom? Eventually, the Trinity couldn't deal with it, and they left into the great unknown. Years and years later, Nachte continued his method of creating life, and made more and more Doges. And soon Duh and Cousins found out what they were doing, and also started to make their own Doges, and eventually many Doges found their way into the world. But the great unknown was still a problem, so Blue managed to find a way to turn darkness into the light, and started creating worlds where these Doges could live. And for a long time, the faction of Trinity Doges and the faction of Cousins Doges lived on their own. But eventually there was intermixing, and suddenly it was impossible to tell who was the creator of who. While most Doges at first had huge roles, many became just background Doges, whose name was a reference to something minor, like a Doge for paper plates, which there weren't that many of in the world. Many didn't know they existed, and they were nowhere to be found in history books. Others were given important roles, just like King Doge, ruler of many lands. Eventually, the Trinity realized that the world they made was too small for all the Doges, and started expanding it into many other dimensions. These dimensions could be traveled to by the dimensional outer space, which was a very dangerous place in itself. Now there were 4 Doges that everyone knew, no matter what dimension they were in: King Doge, the Doge, Cousins Doge, and the Trinity. And the Trinity was happy, but not entirely happy, because they knew that Cousins, the Doge who didn't even want to grant them their freedom, was known just as much as they were, that they weren't considered the creator of the world, but that they were one of the creators of the world. But they didn't really care. They planned to go out on their own into a random dimension and live their own lives. With the amount of Doges there were, it wouldn't be hard to disguise yourself and to live a normal life just like everybody else. So the Trinity each started living their own lives and interacting with other Doges. And as the Trinity explored the world, They taught about how simple their lives once were, just singing and dancing together with the Doge. But as that happened, cousins realized that the Trinity was no longer there, and they announced themselves as the one true creator of the world. And soon people forgot about the Trinity, which didn't make the Trinity happy, and so they planned to kill Cousins Doge and also the Doge, the one who called himself the Lord of Time and Space. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of the story. And as I said, at the end of each chunk, I want to explain some stuff since the narrative format doesn't give me a lot of chances to explain my thinking. And obviously, there are some very big assumptions I made. First of all, we don't actually know whether Nachte was the one who created the Doges. But since the other two members of the Trinity have huge roles, like Blue making the land, the Doges like Blue making the land, the Doges live in, and Space making the dimensional outer space, it would make sense that Nachte was the one who made the Doges. Nachte being the creator of the Doges would also explain some of the decisions he made during the First Doge War, an event I am going to talk about in the second chunk of the timeline. Another thing is cousins. There is one big question many people ask. When the Trinity was split from him, was he the first Doge created, or was the Trinity the first 3 Doges created? While the information is unknown, as we have less information about the beginning of time than about other events in the history of the game, I assume Cousins was the first Doge. Mainly because I think that the reason Cousins acts the same as before the split is because he is a completely new Doge that was created equally from pieces of the Trinity, unlike other Doges which are created with uneven amounts of each member of the Trinity, in turn creating unique personalities. Also, it would explain why he wants the Trinity to return, as the equal amounts of all 3 of them would want to return to their former self. Anyways, the reason I mentioned these quite small details is because, as I already said, they both explain further the reason behind the first Doge War happening, and in turn what set up the second Doge War and the events of Find the Dogeheads 2. Another thing I want to talk about is King Doge. Despite being very important in the events of the first and second Doge War, not a lot is known about his origins, or even how he rose to power, yet there are 2 small details I would like to mention. Many lore details around the game point to King Doge being one of the first Doges made by the Trinity, which would potentially explain how he rose to power, but as well as already knowing from other lore details, Doges act differently based on whether they were made by the Trinity or by Cousins Doge, and King Doge's personality suggests he is made by Cousins Doge, so which is it? As one of the lore deposits hidden in the void says, "One who is die shall be shall not who die shall be." Also, after writing the script to this theory, the newest leak seems to point to the fact that King Doge is made by the Trinity, despite having the personality of one made by Cousins. I've been waiting for a while to release this video, and this new leak seems to have a lot of information that will really help fill in the missing details. The leak has a bunch of more interesting information that confirms theories I talked about in this video, and some even explaining some of the events during the First Doge War. This also seems very familiar to the lore of another game I've covered before that Find the Dogeheads 2 is based on. Another thing I would like to talk about is the theory that Polkia was always a member of the Trinity and wasn't just made to end the First Doge War, but I found many reasons that theory can't be true. For example, in a confrontation that Blue has with her, he mentions how Polkia looks just like the other 3, but also looks like someone he never saw before. Many people have tried to explain that plot hole, but none of the explanations make any sense. The main argument for people who think Polkia always existed is due to something she does later on in the story, which I will talk about in the second part. So with all that in mind, we can close the book on the foundation of Find the Dogeheads 2. Next week, I will come back to talk about one of the most confusing parts of the entire timeline. Part 2, the First Doge War. And I promise it will be next week. No more waiting around, as I too am eager to get this finished with. Another thing I promise is that we will actually get to talk about Find the Dogeheads 2. I would have liked to have talked about some of the events of Find the Dogeheads 2, like the origins of Killanova, or the lore behind Dogemas, but there isn't much about those events that has to do with the very beginning of the timeline. Also, let's be honest, most of the modern events have nothing to do with the grand scheme of things. Now, Space always said he would love to make a prequel game where you get to explore the world before the events of the First Doge War, but just like all other cancelled spin-offs, it is most likely never going to be made. even if it would explain all the theories we still have about this part of the timeline. Anyways, I'm excited to share part 2 with you next week, and if you haven't subscribed and rang the bell, make sure to do so you'll be notified when that part drops. I can't wait to see your thoughts in the comments below, and as I always remind you, it's just a theory, a game theory. Go easy on me, I tried my best.